It was a lively Friday evening at the Lexington Grill, a high-end steakhouse nestled in the heart of Dallas, Texas. The restaurant exuded an air of sophistication, the kind of place where business deals were sealed over aged whiskey, where anniversaries were celebrated with perfectly seared filet mignon, and where the scent of sizzling prime cuts blended with the faint aroma of truffle butter and fresh herbs. The establishment was known for its impeccable service, an elite clientele, and an atmosphere that struck the perfect balance between refined elegance and relaxed indulgence. The dining room hummed with energy. Well-dressed patrons filled the dark leather booths and linen-draped tables, their conversations interwoven with the soft, sultry notes of a jazz trio performing near the bar. The musicians, an upright bassist, a pianist, and a saxophonist, played effortlessly, their melodies mingling with the clinking of crystal glasses and the occasional burst of laughter from a nearby table. Dim, amber lighting cast a warm glow across the room, reflecting off the polished wood floors that gleamed under the movement of waiters in crisp, white uniforms. They maneuvered through the space with a graceful efficiency, balancing silver trays laden with artfully plated dishes, their motions so practiced and smooth that they almost seemed choreographed. The front door swung open, allowing a brief gust of cool evening air to slip inside before closing again. In that instant, the bustling rhythm of the restaurant continued uninterrupted, but a subtle shift in the atmosphere occurred, an imperceptible pause, as if the very walls of the Lexington Grill had acknowledged the arrival of someone noteworthy. Stepping into the entryway was a distinguished elderly black woman, her presence exuding a quiet dignity that demanded neither attention nor approval, yet effortlessly commanded respect. Margaret Daniels, at 78 years old, carried herself with the kind of grace that only a lifetime of experience could bestow. Though time had slightly softened the contours of her face, there was an undeniable strength in the way she stood, her back straight, her shoulders squared, a lifetime of wisdom and resilience etched into the poised lines of her expression. She was dressed impeccably, her fashion choices a reflection of understated elegance. An emerald green coat draped over her shoulders, its fine wool fabric catching the ambient light, accentuating the richness of its hue. Beneath it, she wore a tailored black dress that skimmed just below her knees, the kind that never went out of style, timeless, sophisticated, effortlessly refined. Around her neck rested a simple strand of pearls, each luminescent bead reflecting the soft glow of the chandeliers above. Matching pearl earrings adorned her ears, their gentle shimmer drawing the occasional appreciative glance from those nearby. In one hand, she carried a sleek black leather handbag, the kind that bore no ostentatious brand markings, yet its craftsmanship spoke volumes of its quality. In the other, she held a neatly folded reservation slip, a small but significant detail that signified she was not merely passing through, she belonged here. Margaret's gaze swept the room, not with the hesitant curiosity of an outsider, but with the quiet discernment of someone who understood her surroundings. She took in the details, the way the staff moved, the way the guests laughed a little too loudly after a second glass of wine, the way the manager near the bar was subtly scanning the room, ensuring everything ran smoothly. This wasn't her first time in an establishment like this, and it certainly wouldn't be her last. She wasn't flashy, yet people took notice. Not because of ostentation or grandeur, but because of the aura she carried, one of unwavering self-assurance, of history, of dignity. Margaret Daniels was a woman who had lived, who had seen, who had earned the right to exist in any space she chose. And tonight, she had chosen the Lexington Grill. Margaret approached the hostess stand, her polished black heels clicking softly against the gleaming wood floors. The restaurant was alive with movement, the hum of conversation weaving through the air as silverware clinked against fine china. A young woman stood behind the podium, her straight posture and uniform crisp white blouse, tailored black vest exuding professionalism. Yet, as Margaret stepped forward, the hostess's polite demeanor seemed to falter ever so slightly. "Good evening, ma'am. Do you have a reservation?" the young woman asked, her voice even, though there was the faintest hint of hesitation in her tone. Margaret offered a warm smile as she unfolded the small slip of paper in her hand. "Yes, under Daniels." The hostess flicked her eyes to the reservation list, scanning down the neatly printed names with well-practiced efficiency. A brief nod. Then she lifted her head and gestured for Margaret to follow. Right this way. Margaret moved gracefully behind her, navigating the elegant dining room with its high ceilings and glittering chandeliers. She passed well-dressed patrons engaged in lively conversation, their laughter mingling with the distant melody of the jazz trio playing near the bar. Plush booths lined the walls, candlelit tables filled the central space, and large windows offered a picturesque view of the city skyline. It was clear that the restaurant prioritized ambience, every detail meticulously curated to offer a luxurious experience. Yet, when the hostess finally stopped, Margaret's gaze settled on a small table near the entrance to the kitchen. Unlike the other dining areas, this spot was less desirable, tucked away near the swinging doors where bursts of heat and the clang of pots and pans spilled into the space. The smell of seared meat and garlic butter was stronger here, almost overwhelming, and the occasional call from the chefs echoed into the dining area. The contrast was unmistakable. Margaret hesitated for only a fraction of a second before smoothing out the folds of her coat and gracefully lowering herself into the chair. She didn't argue, didn't ask to be moved. Instead, she simply placed her handbag on the seat beside her, folded her hands atop the table, and opened the menu. Minutes passed, then several more. Margaret noticed the subtle rhythms of the restaurant, how waiters moved seamlessly between tables, carrying trays of expertly plated meals, how guests barely needed to raise a hand before a server appeared, ready to attend to their needs. The atmosphere was one of smooth, practiced hospitality. Yet, her table remained untouched. Her assigned waiter, a man named Ryan, seemed to glide past her repeatedly without acknowledgement. Tall and clean-cut, his neatly pressed apron and confident stride gave the impression of someone who had been working in fine dining for years. He carried himself with the ease of someone who belonged in this environment. Yet each time he moved past Margaret's table, his eyes barely flickered in her direction. Instead, he was fully engaged elsewhere, refilling water glasses at a table of young professionals, leaning in slightly to exchange friendly banter with a group of well-dressed patrons, promptly taking orders and offering recommendations with a charming smile. But for Margaret, there was nothing. 15 minutes passed before Ryan finally made his way over. His smile was tight, perfunctory, his tone almost dismissive. "Sorry for the wait. We're a little slammed tonight. I'll be back in a bit to take your order." Margaret met his gaze evenly, her expression calm, betraying none of the frustration she might have felt. Instead, she merely nodded and said, "Take your time." Ryan offered a brief nod before turning away, already focused elsewhere. Margaret glanced around, observing how quickly other guests were being attended to, some of whom had arrived long after she had. At a nearby table, a woman leaned toward her husband and whispered, "Why hasn't she been helped yet?" The man frowned slightly, glancing in Margaret's direction, but ultimately shrugged, unsure. The tension in the air was subtle but undeniable. Still, Margaret remained poised. She had experienced moments like this before, too many times to count. And yet, she refused to let frustration steal her grace. She simply sat, patient and dignified, waiting to see how the rest of the evening would unfold. From across the dining room, nestled in the refined ambience of a private table near the far wall, a man in his mid-40s observed the scene unfolding before him. His charcoal suit, perfectly tailored to his broad frame, exuded the effortless confidence of a man accustomed to control. The flickering candlelight danced across the surface of his whiskey glass as he held it loosely in one hand, his fingers tapping lightly against the rim, a habit he had developed over the years whenever he was deep in thought. At first, his expression had been relaxed, his focus divided between the conversation at his table and the seamless rhythm of the restaurant. He had built this place with purpose, poured his heart into every inch of it, ensuring that the Lexington Grill was not just another high-end steakhouse, but a place that stood as a beacon of excellence. Every detail, the perfectly curated wine list, the imported Italian marble bar top, the jazz trio playing smooth, soulful melodies near the entrance was a testament to his unwavering commitment to quality. But as the minutes passed, something changed. His gaze, once casually drifting over the dining room, became fixed. His jaw tensed ever so slightly. The warmth in his expression faded, replaced by something colder, sharper. His fingers, still resting against the rim of his glass, now tapped a slow, deliberate rhythm, a measured beat that betrayed his growing discontent. Because at that moment, Daniel Carter wasn't just a restaurant owner overseeing his establishment. He was a son watching his mother being disrespected. Margaret Daniels, the woman who had raised him, who had shaped him into the man he had become, sat alone at a table far from where she should have been. It wasn't the plush booth by the window, where esteemed guests often dined. It wasn't even one of the elegantly set tables in the heart of the restaurant. No, she had been placed near the kitchen, where the clang of pots and the occasional bursts of heat from the swinging doors disrupted the refined atmosphere that the rest of the diners enjoyed. She didn't belong there. And yet, no one around her seemed to question it. Daniel's fingers stilled against the glass. His eyes, dark and intense, flicked between the players in this quiet, unfolding drama. The hostess, who had led his mother to that undesirable table without hesitation. The waiter, Ryan, his employee who had walked past her again and again, offering service to every other guest but her. The surrounding diners, some oblivious, others exchanging uncertain glances, clearly noticing but saying nothing. His mother, as always, remained composed. Her posture was poised, her expression unreadable, but Daniel knew her too well. He knew the strength behind that silence, the grace she had mastered over a lifetime of enduring situations like this. She had taught him, since he was a boy, that dignity spoke louder than outrage. But that didn't mean he had to sit back and let this continue. Margaret Daniels had been his greatest teacher, the woman who worked tirelessly to ensure he had every opportunity life could offer. She had instilled in him the values of hard work, respect, and integrity. She had supported his dream of opening the Lexington Grill, reminding him that success meant nothing if it wasn't accompanied by character. And now, here she was, being treated as though she didn't belong in the very restaurant he had built. The thought burned. Daniel's grip on his whiskey glass tightened, the cool condensation slipping between his fingers. He took a slow breath, exhaling evenly, forcing himself to remain composed. His instincts urged him to intervene, to put an end to this insult immediately. But he didn't move, not yet. Instead, he waited. He wanted to see just how far this would go. Would the waiter continue ignoring her? Would someone step in before he had to? Or would they all simply let it happen, failing to recognize that the elderly woman at the corner table was not just any guest, but the mother of the man who owned everything around them? Daniel leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable, but his decision already made. One way or another, this night would not end the way they expected. Margaret lifted her hand, a movement so subtle yet deliberate that it seemed almost effortless. She was not one to demand attention, nor did she ever feel the need to. A simple gesture, a quiet signal, had always been enough. It had worked in countless restaurants, at elegant galas, and in the boardrooms of influential men who quickly learned that underestimating her was a mistake. But tonight, at the Lexington Grill, it was as if she were invisible. Ryan, the waiter who had so masterfully ignored her presence, stood a few feet away, chatting with a table of younger diners who laughed at whatever joke he had just made. His demeanor was light and friendly with them, his service swift and attentive. He poured their wine effortlessly, refilled their water glasses without being asked, and nodded with enthusiasm when one of them inquired about dessert recommendations. Yet, when his eyes finally flickered toward Margaret's raised hand, the difference in his response was stark. A sigh audible, exasperated. The warmth he had displayed seconds earlier disappeared as quickly as it had come, replaced by thinly veiled impatience. His shoulders slumped, his movements sluggish as he made his way toward her table, as if each step was a burden. Stopping beside her, he tilted his head slightly, one eyebrow raised in mild irritation. "Yeah?" he asked, the single word flat and unwelcoming, carrying the distinct tone of someone who felt his time was being wasted. Margaret met his gaze, her expression unreadable yet steady. There was no hostility in her eyes, no anger, just the quiet strength of a woman who had endured far worse than an indifferent waiter. Her hands remained folded in her lap, her posture straight, her composure untouched. "I'd like to place my order now," she said, her voice as smooth as silk. Then, after the briefest pause, she added, "If you're not too busy." A simple sentence, spoken with elegance, but beneath it lay something more, a quiet reminder. a challenge wrapped in civility. A test to see whether he would recognize what she was giving him. A final opportunity to correct his mistake. Ryan exhaled sharply, his gaze shifting briefly to the side, as if searching for an escape. His fingers tapped against the edge of his notepad, but he didn't write anything down. His jaw tensed, his irritation now poorly concealed. "I'll be back in a minute," he muttered. And before Margaret could respond, before she could even decide whether she wanted to dignify his rudeness with another word, he turned away. That was the final straw. A stillness settled around the table, a moment so thick with tension that even those who had been merely observing from a distance now felt it. It was as if the very air in the restaurant had shifted, the hum of conversation momentarily subdued, the clatter of silverware seeming quieter than before. Across the room, Daniel Carter saw everything. The slow rise and fall of his mother's hand, the begrudging approach of the waiter, the dismissive tone, the way Ryan turned his back, indifferent, as if the woman who had taught Daniel Carter the meaning of respect was nothing more than an afterthought. Daniel's grip on his whiskey glass tightened. That was it. Whatever patience he had mustered, whatever restraint he had convinced himself to maintain, it was gone. He had given Ryan the benefit of the doubt, had watched, had waited, had given him enough rope to either redeem himself or hang by his own choices. And now, the decision had been made. The weight of the room was shifting. Margaret had remained poised, as she always did. But Daniel would not. He pushed his chair back slowly, the faint scrape against the floor barely heard over the distant hum of the jazz trio still playing near the bar. His movements were controlled, deliberate. His gaze, once relaxed and observant, was now sharp and cold, the kind of look that made grown men uneasy before a single word was spoken. As he rose to his feet, a few nearby diners instinctively looked up, sensing the moment was about to change. The waiter had made a mistake that would cost him, and Daniel was about to make sure of it. Daniel rose from his seat, his movements slow and deliberate. Though he said nothing at first, the energy in the room shifted. It was subtle but undeniable, the hushed lull in conversations, the way nearby diners instinctively glanced up, sensing a change in the air. The soft clinking of silverware against plates grew sporadic, then stopped altogether at certain tables. Even the waitstaff, trained to glide through the restaurant unnoticed, seemed to pause ever so slightly, their paths altering as if clearing the way for something inevitable. Daniel Carter was no ordinary patron. He wasn't just another well-dressed man enjoying an evening at the Lexington Grill, he was its owner. And though he had built this place with warmth, with class, with an insistence on hospitality and excellence, at this moment, his presence carried something different. A quiet storm. He walked with purpose, his polished shoes pressing firmly against the wooden floors as he moved past tables, his gaze locked on his target. His tailored charcoal suit fit him perfectly, but it wasn't the fine stitching or the air of success that made people notice him now. It was the sharp, controlled intensity in his expression. He reached Ryan just as the waiter was laughing with another table, blissfully unaware of what was coming. The laughter at that table faded as soon as Daniel stopped beside them. "Ryan," Daniel said coolly. The waiter turned, still smiling, until he saw who had spoken. The blood drained from Ryan's face. His body stiffened, his casual, confident demeanor evaporating in an instant. "Oh, Mr. Carter." His voice faltered. "I didn't know you were here." Daniel tilted his head slightly, studying the man in front of him. His voice was calm, measured but icy cold. "I've been here." His gaze didn't waver. "And I've been watching." Ryan swallowed hard, his fingers gripping the edges of the tray he still held. "Watching what?" he asked, though the nervous shift in his stance suggested he already knew the answer. Daniel's expression darkened as he flicked his gaze toward Margaret's table. "Watching you ignore my mother," he said, each word slow and deliberate, "who has been sitting there for almost 30 minutes without so much as a glass of water." Silence. The pianist, who had been playing a delicate jazz tune near the bar, hesitated mid-note. Across the dining room, forks were set down, whispers flitted between tables, and eyes darted toward Margaret, who remained seated with the same quiet dignity she had maintained all evening. Ryan's breath hitched. His Adam's apple bobbed as he struggled for words. "Your mother?" he echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel's eyes never left him. Yes. His voice was sharp, like the edge of a finely honed blade. The woman you treated like an afterthought. The woman you assumed wasn't worth your time. Ryan's lips parted, but no words came out. There was nothing he could say. Daniel didn't give him the chance to try. Save it, he said, cutting through the waiter's stunned silence. There's no excuse. And everyone here has seen it. Ryan's gaze darted around the restaurant, his panic growing as he realized how many eyes were now fixed on him. The weight of judgment pressed down, heavier than anything he had felt before. Daniel turned slightly, addressing his manager, Lisa, who had been lingering a few feet away, her fingers nervously clasped together as she debated whether to step in. Lisa, Daniel said, his voice steady, undeniable in authority. Yes, sir, she responded immediately. Take over table 14. Make sure my mother has everything she needs immediately. Lisa nodded, relief washing over her features as she rushed toward Margaret's table, her voice soft with apologies as she pulled out her notepad, ready to make up for lost time. Daniel's attention turned back to Ryan. You're done for the night, he said flatly. Go home. Ryan stood frozen, his breathing uneven, his entire body rigid with shame. His gaze flickered toward Margaret, then to Daniel, as if searching for some way to undo what had already been witnessed by an entire room of people. But there was nothing to undo. He had made his choice. And now, so had Daniel. Slowly, almost mechanically, Ryan untied his apron, his fingers fumbling as he pulled it over his head. He hesitated for a moment, standing there as if hoping for some form of reprieve, some last-minute chance at redemption. None came. With quiet defeat, he set his apron on the nearest table, turned, and walked toward the exit. The sound of the heavy doors swinging shut behind him marked his departure. The moment passed, yet the impact of it lingered. As Daniel turned back toward his mother, the restaurant, once alive with noise and laughter, remained subdued. Conversations were slower, more thoughtful. Waiters moved with heightened awareness, as if realizing, perhaps for the first time, that their actions were always being observed. And at table 14, Margaret Daniels remained poised, calm exactly as she had been all along. Her dignity had spoken for itself, and now everyone knew it. As the weight of the confrontation settled, the tension that had gripped the restaurant began to ease. Conversations, once hushed, started to flow again, though they carried a different tone, more subdued, more aware. The soft melody of the jazz trio resumed, the pianist's fingers carefully pressing against the keys as if trying to restore the balance that had been momentarily disrupted. Daniel Carter took a slow breath, steadying himself before he approached his mother's table. The sharp, commanding presence he had carried just moments ago softened as he neared her, the hard edges of his demeanor giving way to something gentler, more personal. He crouched slightly beside her chair, placing his hand on the table near hers. You okay, Mom? He asked, his voice low, careful, almost hesitant, as if he were still gauging whether she had been hurt by what had transpired. Margaret Daniels, ever composed, met his gaze with warmth. A small smile played on her lips as she reached out and patted his hand, the simple gesture carrying a depth of understanding that only a mother could convey. I'm fine, son, she assured him, her voice unwavering calm. You handled that well. Daniel exhaled, the tension that had coiled in his chest slowly unspooling. Yet, a trace of guilt lingered behind his otherwise relieved expression. I should have stepped in sooner, he admitted, his brows knitting together. His voice, though quiet, carried the weight of regret. He had watched, had waited, had given Ryan the opportunity to do the right thing, and in doing so, had let his mother sit through a moment she never should have had to endure. But Margaret only shook her head, her pearls glinting under the restaurant's dim lighting. No, she said gently. You let him reveal his character. Sometimes, that's the most powerful thing you can do. Daniel studied her, absorbing the wisdom in her words. He had always admired this about his mother, her ability to remain steady, to see beyond the moment, to recognize that true justice was often found in the simple act of letting people expose who they truly were. And tonight, Ryan had done just that. As the restaurant gradually returned to its usual rhythm, Daniel noticed something different not just in his staff, but in the patrons themselves. Diners who had witnessed the confrontation now looked at Margaret with something more than just passing curiosity. There was a shift, a silent acknowledgement in their expressions. Respect. Some nodded subtly in her direction, as if recognizing the quiet dignity with which she had handled the ordeal. Others, still engaged in conversations, seemed to speak with more intention, their tones no longer carrying the same careless ease as before. And then there were the waitstaff. Daniel saw the way they moved now with more care, more attentiveness. Not just to Margaret, but to every guest. Lisa, the restaurant's manager, was at the helm of that shift, ensuring that service was not just resumed but elevated. She personally took over Margaret's table, handling every detail with precision and grace. When she set down the first dish, she lingered just a moment, her voice hushed but sincere. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," she murmured. "This should have never happened." Margaret simply nodded, offering a small but knowing smile. She did not need grand gestures. She did not need long-winded apologies or displays of overcompensation. Her presence alone had already spoken volumes, had already demanded the respect that should have been given to her from the moment she walked through the door. Her dignity had spoken for itself, and from that night on, the Lexington Grill was never the same again. It was not the restaurant's decor that changed, nor its acclaimed menu, nor its well-rehearsed ambience. What changed was something deeper, something that could not be polished or plated, a lesson that had settled in the air, in the minds of those who had been present. It was a reminder, stark and undeniable, that respect was not optional. It was expected, it was deserved, and it was never to be questioned again.